Good morning. Let's talk about exotics. Bad exotics. We're going to talk about the top 10 worst exotics in the Kinetic slot. Now, one thing to be clear before we get going into this is that just because an exotic ends up on this list does not necessarily mean it is one of the worst exotics of all time, but rather this is just of this slot what we found to be the 10 worst in that category, if that makes sense. And secondly, some of these are going to be better in, let's say, PvP than PvE. We're trying to get a rough average between the two of those, and of course, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below if you disagree with any of them. Let's get right into it with the Bastion. The Bastion's initial exotic perk, realistically, was that it was a Kinetic slot fusion rifle. This was way back before Stasis, which feels like, well, it literally was years ago, and yeah, existential crisis aside, the Bastion no longer has that uniqueness. Riptide with a chill clip exists. Bastion's damage is alright, and in PvP, it is garbage. The charge time is way too slow. Once it starts to fire, it doesn't kill immediately, even if you're directly on top of them. The range is just okay, it's just passable. So what do we do to fix it? I don't like taking exotics and just flat buffing them. I find that to be boring. One of the ideas that I saw from my chat while we were discussing this weapon is the idea of allowing it to generate overshields on kills. Now that may seem odd at first, but you remember that the Rat King exists, which gives you void overshields on kills. And the Rat King, despite it being clearly not the best, still finds its spot in the Crucible and in PvE. It still holds on to a niche that no other weapon could really take away from it. So the Bastion, being Saint 14's weapon, giving us void overshields off of kills, it's not too far outside of that line of thinking. Kinetics need a bit of love as verbs from your subclasses continue to get more bolstered up and more leaned into from Bungie's design team. The last one, and the one I like the most, is what if Bastion could crit? Just simply, what if it could hit crits? It would be the only fusion rifle in the game, besides of course the Vex Mythoclast, which is arguably more of like a linear fusion and or an auto rifle. It would be the only fusion in the game that could crit, which I think is pretty cool and on flavor for the Bastion. Next up, Cerberus. It seems like the Cerberus always finds a spot on our list. Last time we talked about the Cerberus, we proposed that it's alt fire mode, which is just worse. The alt fire mode is a strict downgrade to the Cerberus. I don't know why you would ever use it. I don't know how this got past playtesting, frankly. The suggestion we always give is to give its alt fire mode explosive rounds, which will then give it a lot more range and give it some utility. The other idea I have seen, which I think I like a little bit more, is what if the damage profile of the Cerberus's alt fire mode became a shotgun without the ability to one-shot? It would take two. Currently, the Cerberus is just a worse shotgun in all capacities. If you want to two-tap somebody, you have to put it directly on their head and be within, I'm not even sure this is an exaggeration, like 4 to 6 meters in PvP. Regardless, if this was closer to being like a shotgun in terms of its range and rough forgiveness in terms of the requirement for body shot, you'd see it used a little bit more. It'd even be nice if this could work with something like the no backup plans, but that's a bit of a dream. Now, this next one is a bit of a toss-up because I had a hard time deciding between these two, and that is the DMT, the Dead Man's Tale, and the Bad Juju. Both of these weapons came up as possible contenders, and I think they're both overall pretty fine. DMT is definitely more of a crucible gun, and what it does pretty well. In fact, jumping back in and using this again, I was pleasantly surprised with how well it performed, whereas the Bad Juju operates perfectly fine in PvP. I was, again, quite comfortable with it, but it's clearly aimed at being more of a PvE gun. I think the thing between both of these is that neither of them are truly exciting. Bad Juju's whole thing is that it is a Thresh, Subsistence, Rampage, Pulse Rifle, which doesn't feel great, whereas DMT's is, well, initially it was that it was a unique frame, but now we've got other frames of this high-impact scout rifle like the DMT, and it doesn't feel special anymore. So I'll leave this more of as an exercise for the viewer at home. Let's move on to one that I do think deserves a bit of a rework, and that's Huckleberry. Huckleberry, again, is similar to the Bad Juju in that it is just Subsistence with a Rampage perk kind of mushed into one. Huckleberry does increase its rate of fire the longer you hold its trigger, but it doesn't do anything exciting. So what do we do with it? Maybe if the Huckleberry increased movement speed? It's hard to say. The Huckleberry really struggles to find its own nowadays. Maybe if it had kinetic tremors, it would give it some spot, but I think slapping kinetic tremors on just whatever exotic we dislike that's in the kinetic slot doesn't ultimately solve anything. That is very true of the Jade Rabbit. The Jade Rabbit is a PvP gun. Its exotic perk realistically is that it is a stat monster. Its perks used to be pretty unique to the weapon, but when you have perks that now have like rewind rounds, such as I'm so glad I said that the first time correctly. And Precision Instrument, which are kind of the Jade Rabbit's perks, just in legendary form, there's less of a reason to use it. Now, I did mention that the Jade has great stats, and it's perfectly capable of being used in PvP and almost never touched in PvE outside of you just needing an exotic scout for whatever reason, for God knows what. So what do we do to change it? Well, lore nerds can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the owner of the Jade Rabbit, or rather the in-lore implications of the Jade Rabbit, is that it was sort of a medics tool. If I'm getting that right, I could be misremembering that entirely and embarrassing myself. So what if the Jade Rabbit elongated whatever current buffs you had active even longer? So let's say you had Radiant, it makes that last longer. You have Woven Mail from Strand, it makes that last longer. You have Restoration, it makes that last longer. Any type of buff that you have, you get a kill, Jade Rabbit makes it last longer. Or maybe it just makes it last longer just from holding it. It at least now has a place in the game that works in with the rest of your kit. MIDA Multitool is one of my most used guns. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is still my most used gun in the game, and it is hot garbage nowadays. The MIDA existed in a time where having radar up while ADS was unique. It was very powerful, and as Destiny 2 has obviously curtailed the amount of radar while ADS perks that exists in the game, MIDA still holds on to it, just like the Ace of Spades and of course Knucklehead Radar. Its speed bonus and its catalyst giving it, get this, no distractions, really feels like a letdown. MIDA Multitool is still one of my favorites to use just because of how good the weapon feels to shoot, but it's clearly lacking. I think my favorite idea I've seen for this is to allow it to completely stun any champions it comes across, assuming you aim down the sight, similar to something like box breathing. In fact, why not also give it box breathing? I would personally love to see the MIDA really lean into its whole multi-tool element and allow it to switch firing modes between its scout rifle mode to a lightweight auto, which currently doesn't exist, or a lightweight pulse rifle, would give the MIDA that usability and that utility that doesn't really exist in other places in the game. I have heard rumors that the exotic Kvostov is coming back, so maybe that's not the best idea, but you get the idea, something in that ballpark. Next up, another favorite of mine is the Sweet Business. I love Sweet Business dearly. It is one of my favorite guns to use, and again, I think it's one of my most used in PvP, but I cannot deny that this weapon kinda sucks. It kinda sucks. It's just okay. And that makes me sad. Sweet Business did recently get a buff allowing its rounds to deal explosive damage, which is perfect for the Sweet Business's flavor, but it still suffers from the it must spin up in order to be good, and then it is so loud whenever it does finally spin up. You might as well paint a massive target on your back that says, please shoot me in the face outside of cover. I want this gun to be better. So let's lean into the Sweet Business being a loud and proud and on the field type weapon and give it a very slight frontal shield similar to a glaive that has a very slight damage resist, just enough to keep it out of the range. Let's say a 140 hand cannon 3-tap, of which is the bane of this weapon, or alternatively allow it to have perfect hip fire accuracy and a shite ton more range. The Sweet Business does not deserve to have such a limited range of which it is successful in for the amount of work it takes to really get this thing working, and you're just going to get your stuff eaten when you're in PvP. And in PvE, it's fun, everyone loves it, especially the Titans, but no one's really using this thing outside of the novelty. Next up is the Last Word, a weapon that has been notorious throughout the Crucible's history, and is now in a place where it is still pretty good. It's not bad, but again, it's lacking a certain exotic feeling outside of its frame being different. The hip fire feels great on controller, of which you're seeing here, but in PvE, why use this thing? And there's not necessarily a requirement for every weapon to be good in both PvP and PvE, but I feel like the Last Word has slowly fallen behind, and it could get something that helps give it more diversity. So an idea I've had is, again, taking the idea of the Rat King, you know, a kinetic weapon giving us subclass flavored buffs. What if the Last Word got its catalyst, which has been talked about as being called High Noon, which when you swap to this weapon, it will give you Radiant if you can get a kill within the first 6 seconds. In other words, if you draw, you do that little quick draw with the Last Word, and you're able to get a kill, you now have Radiant, a kinetic weapon giving you a solar buff. Obviously, the Last Word itself can take advantage of it just being a slight bump in damage, but it can't do anything else with it other than just use Radiant for what it is. Your other weapons, however, absolutely can. And the last word being based off of Shin Malphur, again, lore nerds can correct me if I'm wrong, feels in flavor for a weapon such as this. Next up is the Vigilance Wing, another weapon that has this weird spot in the meta. It feels fine, but when everything else in the game is not just a cold cup of coffee, but rather like a Dutch Bros triple shot, extra caramel in your veins, throw it in my eyeballs, put gummy bears in the thing as an exotic, the Vigilance Wing feels just weirdly out of place. The whole gimmick of the Vigilance Wing is being with allies and having your allies die, which I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound great to me. Now, the perks it gets when allies die through its Harsh Truths buff is pretty solid. It gives you a bit of a speed boost, some health coming back. Overall, all right. And in PvE, this... Why? Why would you ever... There's no time when allies dying is a good thing. Like, it's going to happen in PvP, so, you know, it just kind of operates with these buffs, which is pretty telling that the weapon doesn't get used more often, despite it pretty much constantly having these buffs. But why would you ever use this in PvE? An idea I've seen thrown around is to give it a restoration style effect or a cure style effect when you get kills standing your allies or when an ally dies, something along the lines, again, leaning into the verbs that we already have available to us to make the weapon feel a little bit more present and how the direction and the design of the sandbox is currently going. Speaking of a strangely out of place weapon in design, is the Wicked Implement. A relatively new weapon. The Wicked Implement, it's not great. I would take DMT or the Bad Juju over this thing every single day of the week, but the Wicked Implement feels like a primary weapon with Chill Clip is sort of its gimmick. But scouts in PvE really need to do something spectacular in order to see any significant play. Polaris Lance has finally received what it has been looking for, and that's because it is now causing small scorching nukes on targets, whereas the Wicked Implement is slowing and eventually freezing targets, which is not nearly as powerful despite how many rounds it's able to hold on to. The Wicked Implement feels like a negative version of the Polaris Lance, and it's just not doing its job. And in PvP, a 180 scout without the ability to get a strict damage buff just doesn't feel good. Even running this thing with the Mask of Bacchus in order to get free damage buffs, it still doesn't feel good. And I think that if this was as simple as changing its frame from being a 180 to a rapid fire frame, it might maybe see some play. Maybe. Just from the sheer fact that you'd be able to get to its buff slightly faster, maybe it would see some play. It's, again, not awful, but it definitely could be better. But let me know what your thoughts are. If you've got an exotic that you feel like should have been on this list, drop that in the comments below. If you enjoy my more unhinged rants, subscribe, like, and I don't know, go tell your mom that you love her. Bless your faces and deuces.